Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exceptional podcast. I'm Dan Clark, and today I am very excited to be joined by Nick Chapsas, who is probably best known for his amazing .NET YouTube content. And if you haven't watched any of his videos, stop what you're doing right now, pause the podcast, go to the show notes.
Don't do that. Just listen to the podcast.
No, I disagree because they are so good. So yeah, stop what you're doing, pause the podcast, go to the show notes, click the link and click subscribe. At least do that anyway, click subscribe on the channel. The listeners can't see this, but Nick's getting pretty excited in the video now. But I'm very confident that anyone who enjoys this podcast, will love Nick's content. And he has just hit 100,000 subscribers too. So congratulations on that milestone, Nick, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. Long time fan of the podcast. Very excited to be here.
Oh, thank you very much. That's good to hear. We're only 33 episodes in, so it's we're getting there. But yeah, that's 100,000 subscribers. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. The funny thing is, if you watch how the channel grew, the first 2 years, it was basically me, my dad, and my mom listening and we're watching. And third year, it just skyrocketed, and a bit overwhelmed, to be honest. It's insane.
Have you got a graph over time of how many subscribers?
I do. And it's pretty insane, especially the last year. I think I just found all the ways you can't make a good video first 2 years. So now I'm just making the good ones.
Well, I'm definitely proud to be one of those subscribers. So could you give the listeners a quick intro into your background and what you do, obviously, apart from these videos, or as well as these videos?
Yeah, so like I already mentioned, I'm Nick Chapsas. I live in London for the past 10 years. I'm originally from Greece, even though you can't tell by my very British accent. And yeah, I came here to study, stayed here. After I studied, I really like the weather here. This is not a joke. I really like the weather here. Greece is just too hot for me. And ever since, I've been working here and really enjoying it. I was desperately looking for a job. First job that was offered to me was a .NET job. And that's how I got into .NET professionally.
Nice. My sister-in-law actually a couple of years ago moved over to Australia, and whilst the weather sounds amazing there, I think I would miss the seasons.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really have much of a summer here per se. Now it's pretty sunny. I'm hot here, but yeah, I just prefer London weather over anything. And London in general. I really love it here.
How have you found it during lockdown in London?
It's been fine. Well, lockdown in London, it wasn't really a thing. You were going to Hyde Park and all those parks, and you just saw people around starfishing under the sun. It's the first lockdown was a very sunny time too, so it was a very unfortunate thing that everyone was just going out. But overall, it was pretty good. I managed to buy a house during the lockdown, so that was great.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
We started looking into whether to move away because I'm remote from now onwards, so it's I don't need to be near a train station or anything, so we're looking further away. And we saw the house prices in seaside kind of locations, shooting up. But I don't know, so I was unsure whether London house prices would shoot down.
They're skyrocketed. When I bought, they removed the stamp duty, and what everyone smart did was just integrated it to the house price. Yeah, price a bit high.
Yeah, I forgot about the stamp duty thing. So, are we allowed to mention your little bit of news that you mentioned to me last week?
Yeah, depending on when this goes out. If it's after the 1st of April, yeah, we can announce that I'll be doing YouTube full-time now. I had a great run for 3 years with my current company, checkout.com, which, for everyone listening, just a small plug, great place to work, by far the best one I've worked for. But it's just that this thing grew way past my expectations, and I kind of have to see it through. So I'm putting way more effort in that now, and way more things are coming, which is exciting and a bit scary because I've never been self-employed before. You always have this fallback that I'm just going to have my salary every month. I won't have that anymore. So my mom's like, I don't know about that. I'm like, Mom, you have your own business. I don't know about that. So it's a bit like this.
Yeah, well, if you're doing it full time, the content you're creating at the moment is amazing. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what you come up with.
Yeah, me too. And surprisingly, more in .NET YouTube doesn't necessarily mean more views. More videos doesn't mean more views or more people watching. Because it's programming and people have full-time jobs, and you basically ask for their attention, which they could spend making money by coding. if you create like very long or many videos, people will just get detached from the content and not watch it after a while. So you have to strike a very good balance, from what I found from my own experiments.
Looking at your website, it looks like you're not just doing the YouTube videos, you're doing different training content and various other things as well.
That is correct. I recently, in early December, I started doing courses as well, which I was very skeptical about because I don't want to sell something unless I truly believe you'll get value out of it. I get like very bad imposter syndrome about asking people to pay money and then not delivering to their expectations. What's great about that is after hundreds of people purchasing content, none of them has requested a refund. Well, I think it's maybe like one. So it's a very low refund rate. And, with anything like that, I'm asking, what do you want to see? What should I do different? How can I improve? So I think future ones will be even better. But yeah, I'm focusing a lot of my effort there, and then conferences and also workshops. So hopefully we're going to have something to announce on that front as well.
Exciting times ahead. Yeah, so this will be published around the 1st, so I think we should be able to time shift it well enough to be able to include this in the podcast. So we're going to do something a little bit different in this episode. So the kind of stuff that Nick covers in his videos are exactly the kind of thing I find interesting and like to cover in this podcast too. So I thought it would be a bit of a shame to have Nick on and only geek out on a single topic. So we're going to do a few mini geek outs on different topics in this episode. And I've got my little kitchen timer and only Nick can see me holding this up. And yeah, so we're going to maybe 15 minutes each topic and see how it goes.
Well, fingers crossed. I don't know how that will go, but we'll give it a go.
It should be interesting. So for the listeners, the topics we were thinking of was Minimal API, which came out in .NET 6. So talking about that. Also, the outdated opinion of some non.NET developers on .NET. We're going to talk about GitHub Copilot. And then lastly, MediatR. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Some of those topics are quite interesting. But first, though, let's do this episode's listener mention. And in fact, I'm going to do 2 this time because they were quite funny. Well, the first one is actually 3 people. So I randomly tweeted out last week a joke tweet that just had a line of code saying, throw a new unhandled exception podcast. So, one of those spur of the moment tweets. But then Steve Collins, who's actually been a guest on the show before, replied back with more code, which was a catch block, catching the method and calling a method called listen. Then Pete Gallagher, who has also been a guest on the show, replied to that with a finally block with a method in it called send new tweet, passing in the string, we love this podcast, which was awesome to hear. And then Mark Oliver took a screenshot of those 3 tweets and tweeted, our .NET community is awesome. Dan, Steve, and Pete being truly geeky made me laugh out loud. So I probably didn't do it justice trying to explain the code in the tweets, but it was funny at the time, so I will link to that in the show notes. But thank you, Steve, Pete, and Mark, for joining me in being quite nerdy. And one more listener mention, because this one was a bit spooky. Not the tweet, but something the tweet highlighted. And this one is from Clifford Agius. And he said, listening to the Unhandled Exception podcast with Dan and Jess White, very good so far and interesting to hear how the team skills are things we are trained to do in aviation. But the best bit is how they managed to make the podcast exactly to the second 1 hour. That's some skill. So I was a bit mind blown by this because until he tweeted it, I had absolutely no idea that it was exactly to the second 1 hour. It certainly wasn't intentional, but he was right. I checked, and coincidentally enough, it was. So, I mean, seriously, what are the chances of that? So thank you, Cliff, for spotting that and for your kind comments. So if you want to get mentioned on the show, just send a tweet using hashtag unhandledexception. All feedback is greatly appreciated. And I'm Dracan on Twitter, Dracan. Right, so the first topic we were going to cover is the new .NET 6 Minimal API. So I tried this once, realizing that everything was in the same C# file. And then I tried to break things up into different files, which of course meant classes. Then I realized that those classes may as well have just been controllers because controllers actually do a lot of stuff for you. So then I just went back to normal web APIs. So that's kind of the extent of my experience with playing around with minimal API. And I'm hoping I've completely misunderstood that, and you're going to tell me how minimal API projects don't have to all be in one big, massive, huge C# file.
Then minimal APIs do not have to be in a huge C# file.
Yes, that's good to hear. I was hoping you were going to say that.
But the thing is, your experience is very accurate to other people's experience. So it's either everyone starts playing with them and they create a huge program.cs file and they have like all the classes there and everything, and they do not split anything to anything. And to be honest, Microsoft's repos and examples and sample projects kind of do that. Now, they do it to make it easy for us to see everything in a single file, but people perceive that as if you should do it that way. And that's wrong. The way I describe minimal APIs is minimal APIs is the most stripped down version of having a web API running in some way. Because like you said, controllers, yeah, they do a lot for you. But the question is, do you need that a lot out of the box? And could there be a way where you opt into that a lot, or parts of that a lot that you want to opt into? For example, do you need a model state object in your HTTP context and validation on every request, for checking for attributes or whatever? Or maybe you don't. Or do you want it in some endpoints? And can we somehow make that a bit more modular? Are you happy with the controller structure? Because let's be honest, controllers as a concept is weird. Like, people don't think about this because, especially if you started playing around with controllers in MVC days when you were doing like proper view, model, and controller. But what's the last time you used a view in your APIs? You don't. But that controller is an artifact from that design. We'll just hand it to repurpose it because routing was so easy. And then we kept using that. And your model isn't really your model. It is your API contract. And which one is your model? The one coming in, the one coming out? It's a bit confusing on the API context. And then you have all that implicitly added middleware that you might not want to have in there, but you can't really remove unless you do something really hacky. So minimal API just strips that all back for you. And it says, here's the building blocks. Here's the Lego. Build your own design or structure and roll with it. And it's very unopinionated. It is, if anything, if you squint a little, it looks like Express from the Node world, which is fine because people forget that, and we're going to touch on that later maybe, but minimal APIs tries to cover a spectrum of developers from the very early stages, which might be what most people think this is targeted towards, to the very advanced, microservice kind of world. And the way I think of the structure is it goes early, then, the enterprise, hexagonal architecture and all that, and then microservices. It doesn't have to be in a seniority order. It's just how I see evolution of projects, if the budget is there. So I believe it's trying to capture the very early, which is what everyone agrees on, and the very late, the microservice world, because they are actually more performant than the MVC-based APIs. And the reason for that is those things that you have implicitly in MVC just isn't there anymore. And if you want to add them, you have control over how you can optimize them. Some things just cannot be optimized to a degree in the full MVC. So there's just a lot there. And I think, completely honest here, Microsoft hasn't done a great job communicating that. Because a healthy community needs a stream of developers coming in, because eventually some people retire and they don't use the language. So when you see a language not being used, it's not necessarily that the people using it just stopped using it. .NET has been around for 20 years. We had the anniversary recently. If you're, 35 when you picked it up, you might be retired now. And that was a big bulk of people playing around with C# and .NET. So there's all those things. And I think people just are a bit afraid to go to the new thing because maybe they're feeling way comfortably here and they like the structure. And if they do, that should not stop anyone from using it because controllers are not going away. And that old approach, like if Microsoft decided to deprecate or delete that, I did the math, they will break an approximate of 100% of all the APIs around here in .NET. Like everything is using controllers. So there's always reason to be skeptical, but there's no reason to be negative, I think, because there is definitely an audience for that.
Yeah, I find it quite interesting, your point about MVC, Well, I guess for Web API, I've probably not referred to that as MVC in a long time. I just say Web API. But yeah, you're totally right. There isn't a view there. You're returning JSON. And yeah, so it's kind of like almost MC. And as you say, even the model, that's just DTOs, like request and response DTOs.
Now, you say that there is no view there. There is view support. You can use the controller. The controller class is still there. You can still extend it. And there is the ability to return a view. If you use the controller base, then you don't have that because that's the base. And probably that's what we're using. But it wasn't removed. And everything in the namespaces is still MVC. The minimal APIs now use HTTP, but the old system is built on top of MVC and it's just rebranded. It isn't really changed fundamentally.
So if you did want to use minimal API and you wanted to split that out into separate files, are there any recommended patterns around that, or is it literally just creating a new class?
I think that's the beauty of it. Like, what makes sense for you, right? What do you want? What do you think is an elegant way to do it?
Is that a question or?
it is a question, and I'm going to elaborate to your question too.
So I guess this kind of ties into our last topic of today, because I'm a big fan of MediatR. And maybe let's touch on this while we're here then. And then we can delve more in later to what MediatR is. But I really like the MediatR pattern where you've got a handler and the class has one execute method and single responsibility principle. It allows dependency injection, all that kind of thing. So I do tend to just, in my controllers, just call mediator.send and delegate that application logic. So in a way, if it was only one file, the entry point is quite small. But then if I think about it a bit further, I don't like my mediator handlers to have anything related to Web API. So that includes like the HTTP status codes. So I tend to have my mediator handlers return an enum, which is a business logic enum. And then in my controller, I would then have like a switch expression, which converts the business logic enum to an HTTP status code to return. So it's not quite, in my endpoints, they're not quite, even though they're quite small because it's using expression bodied methods, switch expressions. So it's still quite small, but you've still got that switch expression in the endpoints, which if you've got a lot of endpoints, it still makes that program.cs minimal API. It could get quite big over time, I guess.
So you're mapping from your domain-related response, that enum you mentioned, to that other thing. Now, what if I told you that logic doesn't have to be in your endpoint class, or the incoming from API contract, let's say your create user request from the request body to a create user domain level object. It doesn't have to be in the handler. Because you can move those things in different parts of the pipeline. So your main entry handling point can be that. Because if you think about it, the router is sending requests to different handlers. Your actions, it's the thing invoked after your mediation, which your mediation is from an API call to something that handles it. And then you're mediating it again to MediatR to pass it down to a handler. Now, I don't want to discredit the validity of MediatR because I've used it. I actively use it still, and I think it's great. But I feel like the .NET community in general has a tendency to over-engineer things or an abstract just for the sake of abstraction. And I believe if you look at something like Fast Endpoints, for example, which is a project I talked about, which is built on top of minimal API technology, but it can do that very thing that you mentioned. All you need to do to handle a request is create a new handler, specify how you want this to be handled in an attribute, and then you have the handle method. And you have native mapper support from API contract to domain entity, and from domain entity to API contract, which turns into a response. And that can be abstracted to other classes. It doesn't have to be in the same class. So you end up with the same thing, but you just removed one of the layers. Now, I'm not saying that's the best approach and that's everything that everyone should use. But some people who want to go for that simplicity, but still have the same experience, can go with that. And I don't think necessarily that having an endpoint attribute that specifies the route and the type that this is a get or a post or whatever in a class necessarily breaks everything about everything. Clean architecture is being followed religiously by most people, I would say. And there's a good reason for that. It works. But then it brings a lot of modularity and a lot of abstractions that in my 6-year experience, I never really had to use. And the one time I had to use it, the abstraction ended up being wrong at the time, and we ended up reworking that anyway. Because yes, you can abstract the data layer, but SQL Server and Cosmos DB, for example, don't have the same data modeling principles, So there's a lot behind that. And I am personally a bit tired of that over abstraction. And minimal APIs to me is just that light at the end of the tunnel that I can shape this exactly the way I want.
Yeah, I completely agree about over engineering. I think the most important design pattern of all is KISS. Keep it simple. I won't say what S stands for, but for a period of time, I liked the repository pattern, where now, for the same reason that a lot of people are against it, I've kind of hit the same issues with the repository patterns trying to do too much. And yet, as you say, it's yet another abstraction. So I've and again, we can come back to MediatR when we get to that section, and there's a few more things I do like about it. But having that as the application logic, but even take, for example, Entity Framework, I don't see anything wrong with, because Entity Framework is an abstraction, injecting your Entity Framework data context into the MediatR handler. So I see trying to keep it simple. You've got a handler which does one thing, and you can access your data from there. That just keeps it super simple.
Yeah, I'm aligned with you that when I'm using Entity Framework, I used to abstract it even further, but I'm like, it's an abstraction, and then I'm abstracting it in a repository in the hope that I might go to Dapper because reasons. I don't know why, and I never needed to. So I think some of those things, especially with the less experience you have, they look more attractive because the prospect of the flexibility outweighs the reality of the project. And the reality is, well, it is more grim than we'd like it to be. You'd like to think that you can be flexible and you can change data stores and optimize for things, but it just isn't how projects work in the real world. And I've come 360 to simplicity and, like you said, KISS, keep it simple. I'm not going to say what it is.
Funny. And even if you do need, your example of switching between using Entity Framework, you decide you want to switch to Dapper. You delete your data context, the compile errors are going to show you what to change. So it's not like it's not easy to change over anyway.
Yeah.
I think it becomes harder when you've abstracted everything out into repositories and you've got one method in a repository that's been used by lots of different things. So it makes it harder to gradually change things over, because if you change one method in a repository pattern, then you've broken lots of things rather than just one thing.
Yeah, that's correct. And that's why, again, coming 360 again, that's why I like minimal APIs. It comes down to the other spectrum. I mentioned that it's great for demos, POCs, new developers, because the reason why Python and Node are so popular isn't because they're the best designed languages, then they have done nothing wrong in their decisions and they implement Solid and KISS. And it's they have 3 date time APIs. We're not better, but we're not as bad as Java. That's all I'm going to say. But they're very easy to pick up, and you need developers. For a healthy ecosystem, you need developers who come in and they want to build products. They don't want to build technology necessarily. They have an idea. They want to use that tech. What's the easiest? What's the path of least resistance between me and pushing a product to production that people can use? And I think minimal APIs will help them, because I did this experiment. In Checkout, we started hiring graduates. And I had a graduate in the team. And I did this experiment where first I showed them the controller approach. And then I showed them the minimal API approach. The controller one is pretty weird for a starter, because you have this class that nothing instantiates. So they do new user controller and they look around. It's okay, nothing instantiates that. But then you're injecting those things in here. What instantiates them? Oh, I can find them in the startup.cs. What instantiates the startup.cs? Oh, nothing. Okay, but it must have an interface, because you have a configure services method and a configure method, and you have this middleware here in the services. Oh, you don't have an interface. Okay, then what if I misspell configure services and it won't wire up? Yeah, it won't wire up, but nobody does it because we use templates. Oh, the template is changed now and it doesn't have a startup.cs. And you end up in this mayhem situation trying to explain how everything comes together. And then I throw minimal API. And it's oh, I get that. And also, it's like Node, it's like Express. So they had checked Express because someone said Express is very easy to get started with. And that was part of the reasoning of Maria Nagaga, who I think is the driving force behind the project from a product management perspective. The simplicity to get into that amazing of an ecosystem that we have in .NET. Now, the next step is DDD, MediatR, bounding context, and all that. And I don't know how I feel about that either. But if we take a step further, which is my domain of expertise, microservices, the 10 to 30% performance benefit that I have noticed in services means that I have to run 2 to 3 pods less just for using minimal APIs in my Kubernetes cluster.
Really?
Yeah, it at the scale of a company that's processing thousands of requests a second, it can totally do that. Because the memory consumption is so less, and obviously your pod is constrained to the memory you have. Because you don't think about it when I have my 128 gigabytes machine and I run benchmarks. But when you limit .NET and the garbage collector kicks in more frequently, those small pauses can really affect the processes, 1,000, 2,000 requests per second. And when your like your database calls, for example, DynamoDB is something we're using a lot, it has SLAs on the millisecond, then anything sub-millisecond actually counts. So if I can save time there, people say your I/O will outweigh any benefit of minimal APIs. Not true for every case. It probably will for beefy applications, but for very lightweight microservices that have 4 to 5 endpoints and they're super optimized, you will actually see a very noticeable difference.
Oh, wow. I'm surprised at that because I kind of assumed that even though if for an endpoint that did nothing, if you were doing benchmarks, you might see a 30% difference there. If you've got an endpoint that's calling out to a database, the difference between minimal API and controllers, the whole request, surely that can't be 30%.
No, that is not 30%. 30% is what you said. It is the do nothing sort of controller endpoint. But the 10% is something we would spend time micro-optimizing for normally. And now we get it just from moving things around and not using implicitly a lot of the stuff that the framework offers. And it's also this opt-in aspect because we can now opt into a specific validation, pipeline behavior, and only have it enabled for those post requests or some very specific use case and optimize that even further with the tools that were provided by the team. Read-only spans is a huge one and so on. I won't geek out on performance, which is something I'm a big fan of and the source generation. But you will definitely see noticeable performance boosts if you are at that scale.
That's pretty impressive. That's another reason to look into it then. So we've probably overrun a bit on this one. So I think the next thing we're going to talk about is just how much of a shame it is that .NET only runs on Windows. It's not a modern language at all, and it's totally closed source. That's right, isn't it?
It is, and sadly, if you try to run it on Linux, it explodes, I've heard.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
It's weird.
Right, quick, we're spreading false information here.
Yeah.
So what's the real story of .NET nowadays?
I mean, most people listening to this podcast will be .NET developers, right? And most people know. But as someone who's running a YouTube channel with 1,000 subscribers, I get so many comments from people saying, why bother use C# and .NET, something that only runs on Windows or whatever? Or I'll be doing a demo on a Mac, on an M1 Mac with .NET 6. And it's like, I can't see the VM icon on the bar at the bottom. How are you running this on an M1 Mac without parallels? I'm like, it's cross-platform. And people just don't know that. And I don't think necessarily that the .NET team is doing a bad job marketing it, because many insane driving forces are behind that effort. Scott Hanselman is the one comes in mind. And of course, David Fowler, Damien Edwards, and everyone there, Maria. And it's just that some people don't look at the progression of a language that they don't directly work with. They create an opinion, they keep that in mind, and unless they, for some reason, have to look at it again, it just stays like that. So my opinion, if I hadn't looked at Java since Java 8, which is like the .NET Framework 4.5 of Java, I would think that, why don't you have var? Why don't you have records? Why don't you have... But no, they have added those things in latest versions. It's just that I don't necessarily keep up with it. It's really sad because people who have those opinions, because they've been in the industry for a long time, they're the one making decisions about what language to use in a new project. It's not the new ones and the exciting ones who just look at the project, say, "Oh, it runs everywhere. Oh, I checked the tech empowered benchmark, and it's like over everything and under PicoV." Who uses PicoV? What is PicoV? It's just sad, but at the same time, the efforts of projects like Minimal APIs are actively trying to change that. And I have seen a change, because many of those comments that I get too is like, "Oh, it's cross-platform. Oh, I don't usually do .NET, but like I made a video with that title, The Outdated Opinion of non.NET developers about C# and .NET." And many of the comments on that video were from non.NET developers who are like, "Oh, I'm going to take a look at this because what you're saying is interesting." It's like, what did you wait for? It's like, it's been like this since 2017. I wouldn't go further back because some Linux support was iffy at that time. But there's just so much goodness there. And unfortunately, it's very hard to change people's opinion on things unless they want their opinion changed. And that's rarely true, especially for programmers.
I remember on your video, which we can share a link in the show notes, one forum thread, I think it was, where someone was saying completely false information. And in the headline, experienced developer with 40 years experience. And I don't know whether you remember that one, but if people are seeing that, they assume that developer knows what they're talking about. And what you read out from his post was complete nonsense. And it's just not what .NET or C# is. Your example of developing on a Mac. So a couple of episodes ago, I had Chris Patterson on the show, and he's the author of Mass Transit. And he said he's not touched a Windows machine in ages, and he develops every day on .NET because he's on a Mac. And I also like with .NET, it's not just the fact it's cross-platform, but you can build so many different types of things as well. So desktop applications, mobile applications, web apps, and web apps both server-side and WASM now, so in the browser, web APIs, IoT devices. How many other platforms can say the same thing?
Yeah, not many. Probably JavaScript, but that's because anything can be built with JavaScript.
True.
At this point.
So we spoke a bit about performance before with Minimal API, but another thing that's rapidly becoming incredible in .NET is how fast it can perform. And in your videos, you had a few different charts comparing it with other stuff as well. Can we talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So that is another misconception. And I don't know if people, because it was never the misconception for me. For me, it was always coming in .NET. That is just a thing that only runs on Windows. And you're very wrong for using it over Java, which was the thing it was competing with. And performance was never really a concern because it wasn't necessarily comparable. Like, you wouldn't run Java on Windows, so why are you comparing apples to oranges? And not only is it blazing fast, but it has become blazing fast over every single release of .NET, major or minor. In my mind, minor is the non-LTS ones. So I don't mean like minor, I mean 5, 6, and so on. And the reason for that is it kind of has to be, because .NET really needs a selling point, and clearly many languages now do cross-platform. It's not a unique thing. And what we used to have as a key selling point isn't really there anymore. So having it be super fast and optimized for it just makes it more attractive for companies who want performance. And if I tell you as a current user that going from .NET 5 or .NET 3.1, .NET Core 3.1 to .NET 5, you get like a 40% performance boost just for upgrading, that's an incentive to not stay in that version, and I make the migration process very easy to you. So those incentives will be here both for existing users and external users, I think. And if you take a look at every feature added in .NET, some of those features, like a good 30%, I think, are very performance focused. Look at spans, for example. That revolutionized the way we deal with, specifically strings. I think is the biggest use case, but it can be used in other places. But like read-only spans, huge driving force. Strings are extremely expensive. I don't think that people understand how expensive they are. And using a read-only span to optimize or deal with them can really make a difference to your app. And source generators is another one where you can not only have faster startup time, but also with things that traditionally we're using reflection, let's say the JSON conversion, they can be all generated compile time because it's a kind of deterministic thing. And you save not only that memory, but also the method call itself. So a lot of goodness there. So yeah, we really do need those selling points to get people in the ecosystem too. And we're no longer competing with like Python or Node. We've left those ones behind. We're competing with Rust, with C++, we're competing with really high performance languages and Go.
One thing I see a lot with a lot of teams I work with where, for example, one current team, the team is used to .NET Framework, very old ways of doing architecture, and I'm coming in helping them move to a more modern architecture, and we're using Azure and various bits and bobs. But the team, they're .NET developers, but they're not used to the new modern language syntax. As you mentioned, we've got like .NET 5, 6, like a new release every November now. And so from their point of view, it's moving really quickly. Now, I think if you keep on top of it, so there's a new version of C# and you look at all the language features. I personally use Rider, what ReSharper does the same, and probably Visual Studio, I don't know. But if there's a new language feature I could be using in code, Rider will tell me that, so I can do alt enter and refactor. And that's how I learn a lot of these new language syntax. But a lot of developers don't do that, have no idea about new modern syntax. So that's comparing existing full-time .NET developers. So you kind of like wonder, for people that aren't .NET developers in the first place coming into this, if they Google, a lot of the stuff they're going to see is going to be historic. So they're going to see lots of examples showing how to write C# in an old way of doing things, if that makes sense.
That's true. And not only that, I can right now write a C# project with C# 10 and the same project with C# 7, which isn't that far back, or even 8. And I can make them look fundamentally different, as if they're different languages. There's so many features being added, and I actually had a very good video on that too, which is C# getting a bit out of hand effectively? Because it's just a constant grind to keep up with everything. And now, we can have implementations and interfaces. That's interesting. So multiple inheritance can potentially be a thing. And now, static abstract things is coming. And now, it's a bit much. I like to have, again, I'm going to refer to Legos or Lego, don't kill me. You can have a bucket of Lego and choose the ones you want to build your project, but you can't necessarily expect other people to use the same Lego in the same way. So you can both build a castle, but they're going to look fundamentally different. And that can be a problem because it causes friction when you move from one project to another, from one way of thinking to another, and from one company to another. Ultimately, I believe that if you want to keep your language modern and constantly evolving so you don't fall behind, you don't do a Java, like I mentioned before, then you kind of have to take that hit and hope that people who want to migrate and want to stay up to date will. And ultimately, those who get discouraged and want to stay with .NET Framework, let's say, for example, they can, because that doesn't go anywhere. It's not going to get updated with any major features or anything other than security patches, but it's still there and it's used by every Windows machine heavily. So it's all about choice. It always has been all about choice with me, from minimal APIs to controllers to which version of .NET and C# you're going to use. Obviously, you want to go with LTS because you don't want to use a version of .NET that's not getting even security updates. But it's really up to you. And I believe that a healthy team should want to have that mindset. And again, that's my opinion. I don't know if that's everyone's opinion, but the idea of betterment and staying up to date, to me, has always been a driving force, especially by amazing managers that I had. That it's like, should we stay here or should we upgrade until when we think that's stable, whatever that means? And it was always no. Now, because if we do it later, we're going to fall behind. We have features to build. We have products to build.
Exactly. And nowadays, upgrading to like .NET 5 to 6, for the most, it's going to the CS project file and changing a word. And then, as you say, you just get the performance increase and the other stuff out of the box, really, because it's not like they're introducing breaking changes. So if you don't want to use the new C# language features, you don't have to. So you're not, by changing that one word in the CS project file, you're not breaking your projects. You don't have to change everything. But you have the option to, and depending on the tooling and the ID you're using, the ID will probably make these suggestions to help you learn as well.
Yeah, that's true.
So we should probably move on to the next topic, which is quite exciting, GitHub Copilot. I was on the waiting list for this for ages, but I did eventually get on, and it's kind of like mind blowing. I was typing code and it's not auto-completing a word. It's not auto-completing a line. Whole functions were appearing as if by magic.
It's insane and scary to see how good it is. And it has gotten better. Obviously, it's an AI model. It will get better eventually and over time. But it's just so scary. Not because I'm scared I'm going to lose my job, because I have to tell it what to build in a sense. So I don't think that will never be something that I have to worry about. But the code it's producing most of the time is extremely accurate. And I just need to do minor tweaks. And that being said, C# isn't officially supported yet. So whatever you're getting now is just with the data set that it was fed and what it can make out of that. And, many people are worried it's going to take our jobs. Well, it's not going to take anyone's job. I'm more concerned about security than I am about anything else. The code is going over the wire. How does your company feel about that? I haven't done this on any company code in case Checkout is listening, so don't fire me. But for my own code, I do use it. I stopped using it for videos because it was getting distracting, but I'm using it for my own purpose, and it really saves me time. I am more productive with it, which I did not think I would be, because I had the mindset that I'm going to have to babysit it. I'm going to have to be like, oh, no, you did this wrong. I'm going to keep this part, and that eventually will be slower. But no, it's actually surprisingly good. And the reception has been pretty good too.
So touching on what we were talking about in the previous section, where we were talking about old C# syntax, because the majority of C# code on GitHub is probably going to be older syntax. Do you find that this picks up older syntax automatically?
It does pick up older syntax. That is true. So, for example, let's say in my project, I do not use scoped file namespaces. Sometimes if I create a file, it will assume that I have it or I don't have it, so it can get out of sync. Or sometimes it will suggest code that is happening with a specific dependency injection framework that I'm not using.
I see.
It will suggest inject attributes and stuff like that when it just doesn't make any sense for my code. And it can certainly recommend bad code. So you have to cycle a few times through the code, and it eventually seems to get better. I don't know if it's learning from me or if just the data set is that good and it's evolving. But yes, in my experience, not only can it produce bad or outdated code, it can produce unsecure code. You can say, create a hashing mechanism, and it's going to suggest SHA-1, and I don't want that.
Fair enough. Speaking of insecure stuff, one of your videos about this was talking about actually secrets that are in GitHub, and this automatically just pulling down those secrets into your own code when it's doing the suggestions.
Yeah, that's true. So very early, I don't know, they said they fixed it. I did not have the time to go again and search for secrets, but at the time, you could find some of those secrets floating around because the model learned from the set. And even though most of the time it would change them, I found a few of them that were accurate. In fact, I want to do a video on post-sharp, the, what do you call it? Assembly weaving technology? Aspect-oriented programming. That's the term I was looking for. So I want to find a key. I couldn't find the website. I tried a few times and I got suggested by GitHub Copilot, which is weird, but it worked. And now apparently they're fixing that. And not only that, GitHub actually has a program, which I can't remember the full name, but basically you can register your company if you manage keys, and you can take actions on those keys being pushed to GitHub. So the moment you check in code and the key is matching something that you have told them your key looks like, they will call your API that you expose for them, validate that the key is a real key. And if it is, they can invalidate it, they can trigger a rotation, they can just email you that you did it. So this can happen automatically. And the company I work for, Checkout, because we do payments, we have that service integrated with our system. And it's very handy. But it can be a problem, especially if your company is just doing some proprietary keys that GitHub just cannot automatically detect and not suggest.
Yeah, it is a problem, and I think a lot of it is education as well, because I guess as I'm coding, I wouldn't even think about putting secrets into code. My first thing I would do is, we're talking about .NET, just use the configuration system and having that coming from like Key Vault, for example. But again, it's kind of like people have different experience levels. Some people would just, how do we get this to work as fast as possible? While I'm developing it, I'll throw the secret in there. And yeah, that's how these problems happen. So it's so good that there's systems around it to try and catch this when it does happen. Because as you've pointed out, it definitely does happen. We've seen it on GitHub.
How do you feel about it? About Copilot?
I think it's amazing, and it's, as you say, scary how accurate it can be. As far as I know, it's not uploading my entire source code to GitHub or anything.
So at the time that I read this, it is uploading anything before your cacher or after your cacher. It's basically the file you're on and part of that file. So if you're moving on different files, it's uploading parts of those files to do the crunching on the cloud. It doesn't happen locally. Locally, the plugin is just the UI elements and the interfacing of the suggestions.
It's difficult, really, because if you think about like JetBrains Code with Me or the Microsoft's, I don't know how the live share stuff is, but when it comes down to it, everyone's working remotely, we're collaborating a lot more. So you do have code flying around the wire. So there's got to be an element of trust. But yeah, it's more how the company feels about it. And as you say, it's kind of, if you take each project on a case-by-case basis and say, if this was exposed, what would happen? What's the risk of this? And again, like going back to secrets, if you've not got secrets in code locally while you're developing, then your secrets aren't going to be uploaded.
Yeah. And also, you're hosting your code on GitHub. So they have it already.
Yes.
It's not like they don't know about any of it. It's probably, it was used to train the model potentially.
And even like the code's on GitHub, they have it already, as you say. If you're using something else like Azure DevOps, both GitHub and Azure DevOps are Microsoft now. So it's kind of, if you're using Windows, you're using their operating system anyway. So there's got to be an element of trust, really, hasn't there? Weighing the risk versus the benefit, isn't it?
I'm really curious about the business model, though, because they did mention something about commercial element on Copilot. I'm pretty sure it was on the first page they rolled out. It's going to be free for now, and they're thinking about the actual commercial side of things. I believe it's going to be free for developers and open source projects and paid maybe for companies. They might do that because that's the only model that will work. I don't think I'll pay for Copilot, but who knows? But yeah, at least the way they worded it, it looked like there's going to be a commercial element in it.
But even if there is, if you think about what we have now, like Azure DevOps, you can use that as a company and for pretty much nothing. Some stuff you can put on Azure, depending on what it is. You can do a lot of penny pinching in the cloud, as Scott Hanselman referred to it as. And with all the stuff nowadays, we are so spoiled. So I'm guessing if they do put a commercial aspect, it's going to be for like high revenue companies.
Yeah, the Docker thing.
Exactly, yeah. Like with Docker Desktop, you've got to be a big company before you've got to pay.
Or the identity server thing now.
Yes, yeah. That completely makes sense because the amount of time they spent working on that.
I'm fully behind it. Like, we never said we're going to talk about this, but I think it's worth pointing out that open source fundamentally is flawed because you get into it without the expectation of making money. You just want to build cool stuff. And then your cool stuff happens to be perceived as cool by other people and they use it. And then there's this idea that you're working for them. So I don't think that anyone should go into open source without having a business model in mind, because you're just going to end up hurting yourself mentally, mostly.
Yeah, definitely. I mentioned earlier the mass transit episode with Chris Patterson, and we spoke quite a bit about open source. And basically exactly what you've just said. It's kind of a lot of people have this expectation that the developers of a project are just going to spend their free time and fix this thing for you or add this feature for you or whatever it is. And they're not too kind about it. So it's just remember that if you're reporting an issue or a feature request or whatever to an open source project, have a think about the person on the other end, that they've might have families, they've got their own free time, they've got a full-time job, and they're doing this in their evenings or getting up early. So just be nice.
Yeah, it is. It is weird from all perspectives because you see this person, maybe Jimmy Bogart, which we're going to talk about MediatR in a second, if we have time. He has all those amazing projects, Automapper, MediatR. I probably forget some, but he has many. And people just expect him to work full time on them as if he doesn't have a job. And I think he has a bracket on GitHub sponsors where you can pay for issue priority. And that makes sense to me. But some people which I talk to are like, why are they asking for money? Like they made the project. It's like, yeah, but they made the project because they want to use it and it just happens to be open for you to use. It wasn't made for you, it was made for them. And I think most people forget that. Linux wasn't made because Linus wanted to make what it became for everyone. It's just a cool little project for him. And not every project is as big as that, so you cannot have this adoption and this work by everyone around it. I think the .NET community in general is very good at helping each other. Christian Helling, I see him across many open source projects helping, or Andrew Locke. So there's many of the same faces you see around, but not everyone is like that. And you shouldn't have that expectation. In my opinion, if you're getting, or if you have plans to make a project like Identity Server, or even smaller, and you don't want your time to be quote unquote wasted or your mental health to be hurt in some way, think of it before you make your first PR. Put it in your license. I think the 1 million thing, if your company grosses more than 1 million, then you have to pay something, makes sense to me. And to be honest, the 1 million is a bit too high because if you're grossing 1 million, but in any case, that's just my opinion. But don't be surprised as an author when people demand things from you and be negative to them because they assume something that your actions has told them. Here's this free thing. I'm working on this. Oh, great. Put it in the license, and I think everyone will be more understanding, and you don't have to worry about adoption because if your project is cool enough, people will use it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of these, maybe the author initially just had no idea that it's going to go viral and become a big thing, and then suddenly boom, and it's like, as you say, from a mental health point of view, it's like, okay, this is fantastic, this is good news, it's popular, but how am I going to support this now? All these tickets coming in.
Yeah, you saw what happens with, I think it was the Colors.js project.
I've not heard of that one, no.
So the author of a project called Colors.js, which I think the idea was colors on the console. So you get nice Spectre console type of colors in your console. They had said that they just can't take this anymore and they were looking for someone to take over the project because too many issues, too many pull requests. The project was hugely popular. I think it was getting the same amount of downloads as Vue.js or React on NPM, which is insane. And what they did is they just deleted all the code. They took down the package. They uploaded a bad version that was just printing, I think, the American flag or something in the console, and they just stopped. Now, NPM jumped in. They reverted that. It became a huge thing. Many outlets picked it up. But it kind of shows that for a long time, they were trying to get help on the project. And with millions of people using it, nobody or only a few people would jump in. And to a degree, the identity server situation is a milder version of this or a more professionally handled version of this. And I used to be personally negative about it. I used to think that you made it free. Why should I pay? Why, me, naive, stupid. I sat down. I made my own projects too. And I thought, you know what? They're right. And there's this evolution that some people have to go through to understand that don't expect everything for free, or you don't have to play a part in this larger ecosystem. If you want to be part of the .NET ecosystem, that's the easiest way to be part of it. Just grab a project you use and you like and help it. And we have so many.
Exactly. I think with the identity server thing, one thing that got a lot of people was just before that got announced, identity server got brought into ASP.NET. So I think that was a bit of a, I don't know whether that's a Microsoft problem but that probably wasn't right, that suddenly it's brought into a free ASP.NET platform and then suddenly, okay, it's a paid for product. But in general, I completely get your point. So before we move on from GitHub Copilot, just for the listeners that haven't used or seen it before, you mentioned about cycling suggestions. Just from I've got my IDE open, what does it actually look like apart from the autocomplete, which we've already discussed?
So what I have on my ID is I've signed in with my GitHub account, so you need to be on the beta for this to work.
So is this Visual Studio or Rider?
That's right. I don't use Visual Studio. Maybe a talk for another time. But yeah, as you're writing, things will appear in grayed out version, similar to IntelliCode for Visual Studio, I want to say. Just like Visual Studio Code, and you have key bindings to either cycle through those suggestions, so you can go forwards or backwards, or you can bring up a window on wherever you want. I have it on my right, which I can ask for suggestions. So if it only suggests one and I want more ideas, I can click a button or the key binding, and it will just appear in a box that has separate text boxes with the code I'm about to get. And then I can say accept solution, and presumably this is also training the model that that's a good solution. Someone liked that, so we're going to suggest that more. So that's the main idea.
I use Rider as well, so there's an extension to install into Rider to do that. I'm assuming there's an extension for Visual Studio and VS Code and that kind of thing, but I've not looked into it.
I think I saw Mads Christensen. I want to say it's pronounced.
He's written all the extensions, hasn't he?
He's written the extensions. No, he's written some amazing extensions and some very funny ones. But he made a post recently about which extensions you enjoy or you like to see. And one of them was like GitHub Copilot for Visual Studio. And he said it's in preview. So I think there is a link, and maybe I can find it to download in Visual Studio, but it wasn't for a long time. And Rider got it because it uses the same plugin infrastructure as every other JetBrains IDE, and the more popular IntelliJ IDE had support for it. So that's how basically we got it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Right, so the next topic we've already talked quite a bit about, but MediatR. So I know we've touched on it, but for those that haven't used it, do you have a good way of explaining in audio what it actually does?
Oh, God. So, Jimmy, don't kill me. So, MediatR, the idea is that MediatR is a library. You know what? I'm not going to explain what it is. I'm just going to tell you how Jimmy explains it. So it is a simple, unambiguous MediatR implementation in .NET that makes no sense. I'm going to explain it then. So MediatR is this idea. It's such a hard thing to explain. Well, it's not that hard, but I need a diagram to explain it, you know? Okay, MediatR is a way to do in-memory or in-process messaging without any external dependencies for other packages. So it is a way to get your point, whether that's a request or an object or whatever, from point A to point B. And however it ends up to point B, you don't know. You just say, here is a tomato. Whoever's going to chop that tomato down the pipeline, you don't know. There's going to be a tomato chopper handler or something. Or here's an orange, someone will peel it. But you don't know who will. All you know is there's this black box that just accepts things and returns a response back if you use the return response model, or it doesn't return a response if you use the notification model. There's two. The request one is the more popular one.
Yeah, I really like just the consistency of it. So I mentioned mass transit a few times before, but so I've recently started using that, and I saw a lot of parallels. So mass transit is for event-driven stuff, so you can publish and subscribe to messages, and you have a consumer in mass transit, which is a class, and it implements an interface, and that forces you to have a message called consume, which takes in the message. But the idea is it's one class. It's got one method that it's consuming mass transit, and it supports .NET dependency injection. So you've got single responsibility principle. Everything's nice and simple and consistent. Now, since starting using this, and I'd used MediatR beforehand, then I saw a lot of parallels with the same pattern where MediatR, you've got a handler, which implements an interface that forces you to have an execute method. One execute method, which you've got to have in your handler. You can have .NET dependency injection. So a handler with application logic in MediatR and a consumer with application logic in mass transit feels a very similar and consistent pattern. So I use MediatR for like APIs and that kind of thing, but for when I've got consumers using mass transit, I don't use MediatR because the consumer feels just like a MediatR handler. And this consistency where you've got a handler, you've got your business logic in, it's got one method, and you've got your dependency injection. I just really like that consistency. And also we're talking about controllers before, where you can have a controller saying, I've got one class, I've got put, post, delete, get, and they might have completely different dependencies. So you might be using CQRS or something. So your database writes and reads are completely different. But in your constructor, you're injecting all the things for that big, long controller, where if you're just delegating to a MediatR handler, each of those handlers have one responsibility. So it's just one place. And you can call the name of the handler something in business terminology. So it's very clear what it's doing.
Do you know why I'm laughing as you say that?
Go on then.
That's exactly how minimal APIs work. And that's exactly the problem they solve. And it's basically why I personally use fast endpoints, because I don't know if you're aware of that project.
I'm not. So you mentioned it before, and I made a mental note to look into it. So I'll include that in the show notes, but I've not seen it yet. Let me have a Google while we're here. So fast endpoints, was it?
That's correct.
Right, I've got a page up with some code.
So I've sent a personal video to the author, who has changed a lot of the things I found wrong with the API design, because some of them were wrong. So the images you see are not updated to the latest version. And I can tell you what has changed. But as you can see, it's this idea. If you're on the homepage of fast-endpoints.com, where you have your request, your response, and an endpoint handler. And then you define how you want this to be handled, and you have a handle method, and that's it. And it natively supports mapping from an API contract incoming and the API contract coming back.
Nice. I've not looked at this, so I'm definitely going to be looking further into this. Yeah, the code snippets I'm seeing here are like exactly as you say. You've got a handle async, and this might be one of the things you're saying has changed, but there's like a configure override, which allows you to set up the verb, the root, whether it's anonymous or how the authentication is set up. That looks really nice.
Yeah, and you can just inject the dependencies you want in your endpoint or your handler. And that's it. And yes, that has changed. And also, you no longer do send async. You can actually just return the object. So you don't have to worry about that. But I find that simplicity, it comes back to what you said, which is why we're using MediatR in the first place, because we didn't have the means to have that experience. So MediatR brings that experience in a very nice and easy way. You just inject iMediatR, you say which request you want to throw at the wall, and something returns a response back. And you just map it to your response object, and you have it. And it's very clean and very, very nice. Now, does it need to be a MediatR in the way it is? Maybe it doesn't. And that's why some people just inject services in the controller. And services is a different thing from different people. It's usually people who also use a repository. So the service is the MediatR handler for them, and then the repository is more of the data abstraction, which can also work, by the way. But it looks like we're seeking for that experience actively in one way or another, especially in .NET. I want to give you something. I want to tell you what I'm expecting back. Do something with it. And MediatR is great in doing that. And it's as efficient, I think, as it can be for the job it's doing. Now, there's a lot of criticism, too, with MediatR. I don't know if you want to go into that.
Yeah, let's do it.
I think the biggest one that I see going around, and actually there was a blog saying Service Locator is an anti-pattern and MediatR is an implementation of Service Locator. So MediatR is an anti-pattern, which is Service Locator is the idea that you're passing down your service provider object somewhere. And the problem why this is problematic is you don't know what that somewhere will resolve through the service provider, because it has access to everything. Now, the reason why MediatR does that is to implement the dependency injection and resolving all those services. Because if you resolve a handler through the service provider where it's registered, then any dependency for that handler will also be resolved with the right lifetime, exactly as it's defined in your project. So it's a great way to do it. And actually, Jimmy has a response to that. And that is in a blog we can find in the website, we can put it down below. But it really comes down to the fact that even if it is a service locator, it is not my service locator. It is Jimmy's service locator. And I do not know about it. Like, if I did not look at the code, if someone did not look at the code, they would not know. Would your project be less of a clean project because someone used a service locator? Dictionary.contains key has go-tos in it. Does it mean I'm using go-tos and my code is bad? No, it doesn't. So, I don't know. I feel like the criticism sometimes is not really well targeted.
No, I completely agree. So you can see me laughing. It tickled me when you said you'll put a link down below. Podcasts don't have a down below, but you can tell you're a YouTube.
Oh, no.
Oh, so funny.
Subscribe.
Yeah, click subscribe down below. Yeah, I absolutely completely agree. And it's not like you're injecting the MediatR interface and you're then saying, okay, get required service, my entity framework DB context. MediatR is not doing that. So I think that's just maybe someone trying to complain for no reason, really.
Yeah, but it's one of those things I say time and time again. The other one, obviously, is you don't need it, which, if you can make your project work without it and get all the benefits, obviously you don't need it. Maybe you don't need a repository pattern if it works for you. Maybe you don't need so many things. Ultimately, just find something that works for you and your team. And if it works well, stick with it. There is there's best practices or paths of least resistance and sort of deterministic success. But all of that baggage comes with complexity you're going to have to maintain and teach to people coming in. I have to teach people what MediatR is every time they come in. I would not have to teach them what injecting a service in the controller is. Now, obviously, I have the benefit of everything that comes with MediatR for doing that. So does the benefit of having MediatR outweigh the time I have to spend someone explaining what MediatR is? If it is, I'll use it. If not, I'll ditch it. It's a trade-off game.
Yeah, I would say if you've got a company with lots and lots of projects and just one project went off and used MediatR randomly because the lead dev felt like it, then there might be a bit of a problem because as staff members change teams, they're going to get confused. But if it's a bigger decision saying, okay, we're going to be consistent and we're going to use MediatR throughout so everyone knows it and that's just their default, I think that is where it has a lot of benefit. And I was saying before about one of my favorite design patterns is KISS, just keeping it simple. I would say consistency as well is quite an important pattern. Whatever route you decide to go down, try and keep things consistent. Otherwise, people are just going to get confused and not know where to look for the actual business logic.
Well, what you say is interesting because I have found that people use consistency as an excuse to not move the technical agenda forward. So they get comfortable, and I think they use consistency as we want to be consistent here, so let's not use this new thing. And then it's we want to move to .NET 6 and you're using .NET Framework. So yeah, for consistency, we'll keep all the projects .NET Framework. It doesn't make any sense. So I'm not saying you say that. All I'm saying is it can be used the other way around, and I think it's bad. Consistency is great, but you also need to be in a position to say, this needs to stop being consistently bad or old. Let's make an effort consistently, again, to move things forward and coordinate that. And it's a very hard thing to do, especially if you say you have hundreds of APIs, especially with microservices. I don't know. I don't know if I can say that, but we have many, 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 many projects and many APIs. And it would just be hard to have consistency across everything. So, consistency within the team or the platform. And when things move forward, everything moves forward.
Pragmatic consistency.
Exactly. That's a good title for a talk. I'm going to steal that.
Oh, I've TM'd it too late. I've got the website now. No. Cool. So is it worth moving on to dev tips, or is there anything else we wanted to cover?
I just want to say that in case people didn't know, MediatR also does notifications. It's not just a request response thing. It's also hey, I saw a bear. And then someone will go and pet the bear. Someone will go and shoot the bear, I don't know. I'm not from the US, but you can have one publisher and multiple consumers of something that happened, and you don't have to get a response back to that. You can act on it. Now, is it an amazing implementation? Maybe not. And maybe that's where Brighter comes in, which is another project that it sort of implements the same idea. It's from, I don't know if he lives in London, but Ian Cooper.
Yes, he does.
Working for Just Eat.
He's been on the show before as well.
Yeah. So it's a great project. Maybe look at that as well. And I think it also implements different backends for the messaging. So it's not limited to that in-memory approach. I am yet to take a deep look at it, but it looks very, very interesting.
Yeah, that's been around for quite a while. They've got like Brighter and Darker, another project. And as you say, so MediatR is in memory. So like you mentioned, like messaging before, I don't really think about messaging when I think about MediatR. But if you want it taken out of process and to integrate with other... I've not actually looked at too much into Brighter, but I believe it hooks into different message brokers and that kind of thing. Yeah. Then, Brighter is probably a better option. So, check them both out. I'll include a link to both of them in the show notes.
The description down below.
Yes, exactly. Oh, that's funny. I'm going to start using that now. You pinch my term, I'll pinch yours. So for the dev tip section, this is going to get a small rename because instead of dev tips, I'm now going to call it dev picks because dev tips was perhaps a little bit too restrictive. And I don't know about the guests, but I'm certainly running out of dev tips now. So changing it to dev picks widens the scope a bit. So would you like to go first?
Yeah. So I'm doing this recurring thing in my channel, which is 5 projects, 5 projects that deserve more attention. And it's very nice because I get to like shine a light to projects that are either new, but I believe that what they're doing is great, or long running that I just did not have an influential developer behind them to boost them out. And one of my absolute favorites, like by far, is called Kokona. It is made by, and I'm going to probably butcher this, Mawaki Sawatari. And it is effectively minimal APIs, but for the console. Let's say you're making a console app. They have taken the model of minimal APIs, the whole idea, dependency injection, the delegates, everything, the parameter passing, and they've made it so you can extremely easily create a console application. And as someone who's controlling the lights you see behind me, obviously you cannot see it in the podcast, but you, Dan, or get the weather or a forecast or whatever, I'm making little tools like this that I wire up in my terminal and I just use to get different information. This has just changed the way I build applications. So if you want a different and very elegant, in my opinion, way to build command line applications and tools, highly recommend you check it out.
I've not heard of that. I'm definitely going to take a look, and we'll include a link to that in the show notes. So my pick actually relates to, and this is on topic with calling out open source projects. It relates back to episode 29, where I was joined by Simon Kropp to talk all about snapshot testing and his Verify library. So as discussed in that episode, Simon has made his snapshot testing library very extendable and has a whole bunch of extensions. And last week I was using the MOQ mocking library to verify some calls. I want to say verify, I don't mean Simon's Verify library, I just mean MOQ's Verify functionality, basically saying, has my production code called this method on an interface effectively? And I realized it'd be super useful if actually I could just use Simon's snapshot library to take a snapshot of the entire mock state for snapshot testing. So he didn't have a MOQ extension. So I fired Simon a DM on Twitter suggesting it. And literally the next day, the next morning, actually, it was first thing in the morning when I got up, I had a message from him on Twitter saying he's created the extension and it's ready to use on NuGet. And I started using it that day. That is absolutely insane. And yeah, I've just to shout out his entire library as well. Verify is amazing. I've been using it quite heavily recently. And it's just saved so much time writing assertion expected data. And it's just amazing. So definitely go and check that out. Again, I'll include a link to that in the show notes. But yeah, thank you, Simon, for that super fast turnaround of the MOQ extension.
Fun fact, Simon, and actually the Verify library was part of that first project. It was one of those 5 projects that deserved more attention. So I showcased that and people were like, you can do that? which was like my reaction when I first saw it. And now I'm actively using it too in my projects now at work.
Yeah, I'm using it all over the place, and I can't believe that this isn't just the way you do testing now. It's just, why isn't everyone using this? It's insane.
And it's not a new thing, because I was Googling. It's like the practice has been around for such a long time. It's just never broke through the .NET world. And I don't know where I found out about it.
This will be on Node, I would imagine. Node's got a snapshot testing library, which has been run for quite a while.
Then maybe. But I'm like, and it opens like your editor, and you can choose the editor to like do a diff comparison to what? It's just, if you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend, like Dan said, give it a go. It can really, really make your life so much easier.
How many times if you're searching against JSON or something or whatever, you see it in your test output window, which is kind of like you've got the expected version higher in the scroll. You've got to scroll down, you find the actual version. Then I quite often have to copy each one, copy it into WinMerge, copy the text either side just so I can see it. And it's just a pain. Where in this, if the test fails, WinMerge or whatever your chosen diff tool pops up, and just like you would if you were doing a diff in Git, you can see side by side what the difference is between what actually happened and what a test that passes looks like. So it's quite amazing. Cool. So before we wrap up, where's the best place for listeners to reach out if they have any questions?
I think Twitter is the best place. I started being more active on Twitter. I wasn't for a long time. And then I'm like, all the cool people I follow out there, I might as well start talking. So yeah, because I just had it, just stalking everyone for like years and years. So yeah, Twitter, and obviously the YouTube channel is where you're going to see most of the content. I don't repost my content anywhere else. I just let the YouTube algorithm do its thing. So
Awesome. So yeah, so thank you so much for joining us. And with your news you mentioned earlier, I'm really looking forward to where your new adventures take you.
Oh, me too.
Brilliant. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. And thank you everyone for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter @Dracan, DRACAN, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And of course, we will include links to all the things we've mentioned today in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.